Every community has its temptations, its blind spots. And in a community unified around a set of Christian beliefs and practices, we might all be tempted to assume that here in northwest Iowa, buffered by acres and acres of cornfields, cattle, and Midwestern culture, we all think alike. But of course we don't. Even when we share the same set of fundamental Christian commitments, differences can run as deep as color, confession, catechism, gender, and party affiliation. If we expand our horizon to include those who live all the way across the cornfields in Alton, Orange City, Sioux City, or who live in bustling urban centers, or along our southern border, where the typical Dort student is an ethnic and or religious minority, what then? One of the pressing temptations that Dr. Inazu's writings ask us to confront is the danger of factionalism, the idea that every subgroup is looking out for its own interests. This is something that I hope we take very seriously. What if we entertain the possibility that we owe our neighbors the same sort of respect that we hope to receive ourselves? What would it look like not just to put up with, but to cultivate friendships with people who hold views we find objectionable? And does our faith, in fact, obligate us to treat our political enemies as divine image bearers worthy of justice and Christian love? Dr. John Inazu is the Danforth Distinguished Professor of Law and Religion at Washington University in St. Louis. His scholarship focuses on the First Amendment freedoms of speech, religion, and assembly, and related issues in political and legal theory. His first book, titled Liberty's Refuge, The Forgotten Freedom of Assembly, was published by Yale University Press in 2012. He's written broadly for mainstream audiences and publications, including USA Today, CNN, The Hedgehog Review, The Los Angeles Times, and The Washington Post. It's my great pleasure to welcome John to Dordt College.
Well, it's such a privilege to be with you this morning. Thanks for being here. I'm told some of you are here perhaps by some compulsion, but I'm glad to have you here as well. I'm going to begin with some scripture, not because I'm an expositor of scripture by training. I was a Young Life leader for a few years, but I don't think that qualifies. But I do think that the subject of today's talk does do a lot to anchor Christians in the current moment, and what better place for that than to start with Scripture. So I want to look at the Gospel of John, John 17, the famous text on unity. Jesus has just finished praying for his disciples, and he concludes, "My prayer is not for them alone. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message," that's us, "that they may be one, Father, just as you and me and I am in you. May they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. I have given them the glory that you gave me, that they may be one as we are one, I in them and you in me. Then the world will know that you sent me and have loved them even as you have loved me." So that the world may know about the love of God. It's an important task, and we aren't always so good at it. This particular passage has been with me for a lot of years. I remember reading it in high school and being challenged by it. I've only recently paid attention to the text that comes right before it in the same prayer of Jesus. Here he's intervening for his disciples, and he says in verse 15, "My prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. They are not of the world, even as I am not of it. Sanctify them by the truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world." So Jesus is saying two important things here. He is sending them into the world, but they're not to be part of the world, and he asks God to protect and sanctify them. Now, we could have some discussion as to whether that particular part of the prayer is to Jesus' disciples or to us as well, but I think regardless of how we answer that question, his counsel seems apt for our situation today. And so I'd like for us to keep in mind the threefold challenge from Jesus as we talk about some complex questions of law and culture and pluralism. Jesus says, "Be in the world, be sanctified, and be unified." I'm not going to expand on these ideas. I said I'm not an expositor of Scripture, but I do want them to marinate in the background as we talk through the subject of confident pluralism, and as we work together to love God with heart, mind, soul, and strength. One reason to start with this particular passage is that Jesus' words remind us who we are as the people of God, regardless of the circumstances or challenges that we confront in the world. Yes, we have to be attuned to those circumstances and to love our neighbors within them, but we are ultimately called to faithfulness, not effectiveness, and we know our identity from the claims that have been made upon us. So with that in the background, let's turn to the subject of confident pluralism, and I want to start with an example or a story from earlier this year. Some of you may have heard about it. This involved a Senate confirmation hearing for a man named Russell Vogt. Vogt was a Wheaton grad, and this was for a position in the Office of Management and Budget, which most people haven't heard about or couldn't explain. So a relatively uncontroversial position, but Vogt was or became a controversial nominee. And the reason was that after being at Wheaton, he'd written a column where he'd said, describing Islam, something along the lines of, Muslims, because they don't believe in Jesus, stand condemned. And someone from Senator Sanders' staff had picked up on that op-ed, and then during the hearing, Sanders was questioning Vogt. And Sanders said, I don't understand this claim. This isn't what it means to be an American. I'm not going to vote for this nominee. And I watched this hearing and I thought, Senator Sanders would have had every right to have asked nominee Vogt, will you treat everyone fairly under the equal protection of the laws? But to be taken aback at an exclusive claim of truth about matters of faith, the kinds of claims that many Christians, many Jews, and many Muslims make, did not seem to me to be against what America is about. In fact, I thought just the opposite. This is precisely what America is about, learning to live with the deepest differences that actually matter, where something's on the line. So I wrote a note to Senator Sanders and sent him a copy of my book. I still haven't heard back, but I am not giving up hope. We do, though, have many deep differences that cut to the core of our attempted efforts at unity. So think about this not just on the level of politics, but on the personal, visceral level. Think about how you respond to words or people identified with things like Muslim or atheist or conservative or Black Lives Matter or Make America Great Again, and what the people and the words associated with these phrases do to you and how you respond. It helps to anchor the idea that some of our differences actually do matter. I was discussing this question with an atheist philosopher friend of mine, because this is what we do in our free time, and he was saying, John, it's great that you like mint chocolate chip ice cream and I like vanilla, and you like the Cardinals and I like the Cubs, and you believe in God and I don't believe in God. And I thought, I'm with you on the first part, right? Some of the differences in our lives do make life more interesting, but on really fundamental questions, our differences are not good, and they can be extremely painful. And some of the most important differences that we have are mutually exclusive. It cannot be the case that God exists and God does not exist. It can't be the case that how we treat the environment matters and that it does not matter. It can't be the case that the act of abortion is both morally good and morally bad. So we have steep and striking and incommensurable differences in our society on a host of issues with lots of people. And this cuts against the idea that we like to tell ourselves as Americans. We like to say, we learn in high school, that we're one nation, indivisible, united and in pursuit of a more perfect union. But when we think about it, we're often defined more by our differences than by our unity. And these differences aren't going away, which leaves us nationally with a practical problem in need of a political solution. So the French philosopher Rousseau gives us one possible answer to that problem. Rousseau said, "It is impossible for men to live at peace with those they think are damned." I'd like to hope that Rousseau is wrong, that it's actually not only possible but necessary to live in peace with those we think are damned and with those we think quite differently from. And instead of the elusive goal of unity, I want to suggest in confident pluralism a more modest possibility that we can live together in spite of our deeply held differences. We're not going to bridge those differences. We aren't going to be unified, but we can find something like a modest unity. Now, for some Americans, this urgent need to bridge deep differences is just only recently beginning to dawn. And that's especially true for white Protestants, of which I am half of one, meaning I'm half white, not half Protestant. And one reason this is difficult for a particular set of Americans is that as recently as a generation ago, there was a kind of Protestant culture that dominated the white middle class of this country. Most Americans in the white middle class went to a church of some kind, whether they believed or were devout or not. They attended church, and the white Protestant morality influenced questions of religion and cultural matters. This has changed significantly. As the Catholic writer Joseph Bottom has suggested, perhaps the single most explanatory fact of recent American history is the collapse of the Protestant main line, that institutional body that held together many of our most significant cultural institutions. Think about colleges and universities and hospitals and social service organizations that for many decades were sustained by the Protestant main line. And that change, or that distinction or difference in the white Protestant main line, has ups and downs. It brings some loss of coherence. We now have a question of what fills that gap. Where does our shared morality or ethics come from? But it also allows for an expansion or a greater recognition of the voices and the differences that are actually in this country, and perhaps an opportunity for Christians to be reminded that the claims of Christ and the mission to live as the church is not the same as being an American or being in control. And as we think about these questions, one of the first things to realize and recognize is that regardless of whether one is excited about or laments the loss of a past cultural era, there is no past to which we can return. So the idea of going back to an era of more coherence, going back to the 1950s is not a good bargain for African Americans. Going back to the 1940s is not the place to be if you're a Japanese American, like my grandparents interned during World War II, or my dad who was born in the camps. So for a lot of people, going back is not desirable. There's really the question of what we do in the present and how we move forward. And confident pluralism is one possible answer to that question. In doing so, I mean both words seriously. Confidence without pluralism misses the reality of politics. It suppresses difference, sometimes with the use of violence. And pluralism without confidence misses the reality of people. It ends up papering over the differences for some kind of fake agreement or false unity. Confident pluralism aims for genuine difference without suppressing or minimizing our firmly held convictions. The goal of this framework is not to settle which views are right or wrong, but it's to propose that the future of our shared democratic experiment requires finding a way to be steadfast in our personal convictions while allowing others the room to disagree. Instead of shutting down or avoiding those with whom we disagree, confident pluralism suggests that we allow meaningful space for persuasion and the opportunity to persuade others. Now, the argument I make in the book has two dimensions, a legal dimension and a personal dimension. I'm not going today to talk about the legal dimension too much, but I do think the issues are critically important. I also think they're widely misunderstood by a lot of Christians in this country in two different ways. Some Christians are quite uninformed about the challenges of constitutional law today. And to them, I would say it's important to recognize how significant those challenges are, how entrenched they've been for the last 30 or 40 years, and how they won't change easily. Other Christians are misinformed in the other direction. They're told through fundraising letters from religious liberty organizations that the sky is falling, that churches are on the verge of being shut down, and that pastors will go to jail. This is a kind of uninformed and at times disingenuous fear-mongering. It does us no good as Christians to misrepresent or misunderstand the challenges we confront in either direction. Now, if you want to know the right way to understand the legal challenges, you'll have to read my book. But let me give you at least a teaser here. I think that one of the key challenges that we need to understand as a country, whether you are of faith or not, is the recognition, perhaps paradoxically, that in order to coexist with our differences, we need to provide strong protections for those differences. We need to protect the groups that differ and the people who differ in private spaces, and we need to allow places for those differences to manifest in public. So what does this have to do with the law? Well, I think that one of the legal anchors for this idea of protecting difference is in the First Amendment's right of assembly, about which I wrote my first book. Unfortunately, for me, not many people know about the right of assembly. About 1 in 10 Americans can name it in the Constitution. I'm hoping that will change. But one thing to note about assembly, it's one of 5 rights in the First Amendment. The others are speech, press, religion, and petition. And assembly is the only right in the First Amendment that requires more than one person to be exercised. I can speak alone, I can petition the government alone, I can start a blog and be the press, I can even practice religion alone, but I can't assemble alone. I need other people to do it. This is an assembly right here, and it requires other people. And that introduces a set of values and historical practices that emphasize the fact that we aren't just individuals operating in this country, that we require groups for our formation and our values and our beliefs, and that this matters constitutionally in how we survive as a society together. We have to insist that the people we entrust to govern us honor basic legal protections for our groups and our assemblies, even when those protections create a risk of friction, uncertainty, or instability. But the other part of confident pluralism is that's on us and what we do in our personal engagement across difference. It turns out the law structures a lot of what we do, but we also have a lot of freedoms to be on our own or choose on our own. So think about the free speech right, for example. We have a lot of ability to say what we want, almost anything to almost anyone. Now, there are a couple of limits. What's the most famous limit on speech that you all hear about? You can't what? Yell fire in a crowded theater, unless the building's on fire, in which case you should yell fire. But otherwise, you can't, there are some things you can't say lies that are going to affect the public order. You can't form a criminal conspiracy. You can't commit perjury or insider trading. But outside of that, you can say a lot of horrific things. You can demean and insult other people at the core of their identity. You can cause psychological harm to your neighbors. And then that presents the question for us that given the freedoms that we do have in our interactions with others, what are we going to choose to do with those? How are we going to think about our responsibilities to our neighbors rather than just the rights that we have? This is the civic part of confident pluralism, and I want to suggest that it's guided by 3 aspirations: tolerance, humility, and patience. So let me start with tolerance. Tolerance, as I want to explain it, is the idea that we, for the most part, allow other people to pursue their own beliefs and practices, even when we disagree with them. This is no small thing. As one philosopher has quipped, tolerance is really only needed for the intolerable. But I think tolerance does not actually mean a full embrace or acceptance of other beliefs or practices. This seems to be the understanding of tolerance that exists on many college campuses today. It's ultimately a philosophical impossibility to embrace all difference as fully genuine or fully good. So we're stuck with something that comes closer to an endurance, perhaps a mutual endurance for the sake of coexistence. This is going to mean the hard work of distinguishing people from ideas. Tolerance asks that we treat people with respect. It does not mean we respect all ideas. Think back to John 17, sanctify them in the truth. There is a truth, and we can't lose sight of that. But we also have to recognize that other people won't acknowledge that truth. They will think some of our claims are crazy or evil, just as we will think that of their claims. And living together means that we separate people from their ideas, aiming for fair discussion and allowing for the space to differ about serious matters. That's tolerance. Humility goes a step further. Humility requires us to recognize not only that some people will find our beliefs and practices objectionable, but that we won't always be able to prove why we are right and they are wrong. In other words, humility recognizes that some of our most important beliefs and intuitions rests upon values that cannot be proven or justified outside of our own communities. Sometimes you have to be part of something to understand it fully. Now, importantly, this is a limit on what we can prove or relate to other people. This is not a claim about what is ultimately true, and so it should not be mistaken for relativism. Humility has to leave open the possibility of right and wrong and good and evil, and as Christians, we can't think otherwise. Humility does not impugn the confidence that we have in our own beliefs, but it calls for a recognition that those beliefs often stem from contested premises that other people don't share. As the theologian Leslie Newbigin observes, we are continually required to act on beliefs that are not demonstrably certain and to commit our lives to propositions that can be doubted. This is one reason that a recognition of humility means that all of us, whether religious or not, lives and acts on a kind of faith. And finally, patience. Patience is a commitment to listen and to understand and empathize those with whom we disagree. This doesn't mean that we'll ultimately come to embrace or fully understand their points of view, and in fact, it might mean that a conversation of patient listening leads us to realize all the more why somebody is inconsistent or wrong in their views. But patience suggests that we begin with a posture of listening instead of starting with a caricature of someone else. I want to suggest that these aspirations, living into them, of tolerance, humility, and patience, can help us to bridge relationships across difference. This is not always going to close ideological differences. Some of our differences are going to remain, and we're unlikely to reach full agreement about our beliefs and differences. But it can help us to build and bridge relational distance. We can find common ground with other people even when we don't agree on the common good. Pursuing common ground does not mean surrendering our deeply held beliefs. To the contrary, real common ground depends on starting with acknowledging the reality of our differences, and without the ability to air and discuss our real differences, genuine dialogue occurs less frequently, and our assumptions will go unchallenged. Tolerance will ultimately become that demand for acceptance, humility will be replaced by moral certainty, and patience will lose to outrage. The possibilities of the positive vision of these aspirations seem to be getting bleaker in many ways in light of our national politics, with the collapse of respected authority and institutions, and with the rise of echo chambers and social media. As we think today of another mass shooting yesterday, we highlight even more divisions in our country, the divide between whether thoughts and prayers are acceptable right now. Mike Gerson wrote a couple years ago after the San Bernardino massacre that we have lost the ability to mourn together in this country. And so we're challenged with even starker impediments to finding what that modest unity might be. If we can't even rejoice and mourn together, what can we do? And so some people ask me, is there any place for hope in this vision given the reality of what we confront as a country and in our own lives? One reviewer of my book, who was otherwise fairly kind and generous, wrote that it was doomed to immediate irrelevance because in his view he thought there was not an audience to embrace it. I don't think that's right. I do have some confidence in the people of this country. One reason for that confidence is that the history of the American experiment is really about finding this modest unity, often against great odds. So people sometimes look back to the founding of this country and say, how hard was it for a bunch of white Protestant men to get along? They were the people with the voting rights and the power then. But elsewhere in the world, in the late 18th century, white Protestant men were killing each other for the differences over their beliefs. And so it's no small thing that they figured out a way to get along and coexist across their deep differences. And we have other examples throughout our history of confronting major unrest, sometimes less successfully than others, but finding this modest unity against great odds. For Christians, of course, there's an even greater basis for confidence. not just the story of America or the hope of the American political experiment, but the theological virtue of hope. We can engage in this messy and uncertain world because we know the end of the story. Christians of all people should see not only the challenges of pluralism, but also the opportunities, precisely because of our confidence in the gospel. Think back to John 17 and recall the challenges of Jesus to be in the world, to be sanctified, and to be unified. That seems like the right charge to us in our current circumstances. And so let me suggest three possibilities where we might think of this practically. What challenges do we confront, and how do we assume a posture of confident pluralism with them or in the face of them? The first I want to suggest is the challenge of politics. There is a temptation today to be cynical, particularly when we look at politics at the national level. But I think it's important for us to remember, and actually particularly for you all sitting here as college students, that politics is something that is indispensable in our country. For many people, it's not just the Thanksgiving dinner conversation or a topic of debate, but it is the only vehicle through which urgent needs are addressed at the local level especially. And this is particularly true where the social fabric is torn. This is not a black or white or rural or urban issue. The fabric is torn all over our country right now, and people are hurting. I'm not suggesting a particular policy solution or what you or I should do to engage in politics, but just to say that giving up on politics or surrendering to the cynicism is not an area where we ought to be going as Christians. So there are settings in law and government and police officers and other social service providers that provide political provision in a way that sometimes is a matter of life and death. Christians have a role to play in these settings, not as self-interested rulers, but as active participants seeking the good of our neighbors. The second area where we can think about engaging more confidently is across racial differences. Here, Christians of all colors, but particularly white Christians, can better grasp the deep and continued challenges of structural racism in this country, the enormous consequences to communities of color of mass incarceration, of neighborhood and school segregation, and of education inequity. Christians of all races can learn how longstanding policies disproportionately harm some of our neighbors. Learning about these challenges and working to do something about them matters, but our language and our posture also matters. In these current and fast-changing cultural times, I want to suggest that particularly white Christians should avoid calling themselves the new minority or claiming that they are being persecuted. Don't hear me wrong here. I'm not saying that there are not challenges or injustices against Christians and white Christians in this country. There are, and more are coming. But given the historical realities of our history and our present circumstances, it will be a long time before Christians are the new minority in this country. African Americans, Muslims, and gays and lesbians are minorities. Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, and to some extent Catholics, have been persecuted. I'm not saying that these things can never happen to white Protestants, but it won't happen overnight, and we in some ways are better served by thinking more precisely about our language. I think, too, here we have resources of Christians, other Christians in this country and in the global church who have been in harder circumstances, who can know what it means to confront a more hostile culture, and that we might have much to learn from those communities. And then a final example of confident pluralism is our engagement with other faiths, particularly in the cause of religious freedom. Many Christians today feel increasing legal pressures to their institutions and their ways of life. And some of these challenges are significant. I serve on the board of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, and InterVarsity has been kicked off of college campuses around the country, in large part for its claims to exclusive Christianity and its positions on sexuality. There are social service agencies confronting regulations in tension with their missional convictions. There are Christian healthcare facilities that are going to confront greater challenges, and some Christian colleges also face challenges. We should not be naive to these issues, and we must work diligently for appropriate legal and policy responses. But we also have to make our case publicly accessible in terms that appeal to people of goodwill, those of faith, and those of no religious tradition. In doing so, we can't ignore the importance of religious liberty for everyone in this country. There is no principled legal or theological argument that looks only to the good of Christians. Today's cultural and political climate makes it essential for Christians to pursue meaningful friendships and public partnerships with American Muslims. We would benefit from such partnerships in pursuing charitable work on behalf of others, in advocating for religious pluralism on college campuses, and in defending the importance of religious liberty for all. We can pursue these efforts on the local level too, engaging with Muslim neighbors and learning to love them well. I wrote these 3 specific applications of politics, race, and religious liberty in an article co-authored with Tim Keller in June of 2016, which now feels like an awfully long time ago. But I think that changes we've seen and instabilities and uncertainties, however you perceive them or react to them in the last 18 months, have made the idea of confident pluralism, and particularly the posture that Christians take within it, increasingly urgent. I think that Christians especially should be able to pursue the possibility of confident pluralism because we know the end of the story, because we put our trust and faith elsewhere. And in doing so, we might start with fairly modest efforts in reaching out to neighbors around us and sharing a meal with someone with whom we disagree. And this sounds like fairly little stuff, and maybe it is. I said earlier that we're in pursuit of a modest unity, and maybe that modest unity doesn't actually get us very far. Or maybe confident pluralism doesn't give us the American dream, but perhaps it allows us to avoid the American nightmare. Christians of all people can be leading these efforts without fear or timidity, out of love of neighbor and out of a hope of what is to come. Toward that end, we have a lot of work ahead of us, but we know that we can pursue tolerance, humility, and patience because we ground our lives in faith and hope and love. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Yuban Lee, and on behalf of Dordt College and Student Symposium, I would like to thank Dr. Inazu for coming out and speaking to us. So if you can join me in thanking Dr. Inazu one more time. And Dr. Inazu will be continuing his conversation at SB 6.